subliminal message in the intro. If you can hear this, you should definitely. I don't know. I got nothing. All right, welcome back to the Boxscore Geeks show, the only show where we call in sick to work to go to a Wisconsin Badgers game, well, at a bar, and to be let down in a disappointing fashion. So, in hindsight, I wish we'd have just run the show on Monday, Brian. But that said, that gave a little bit of time for some topics. So, actually, on today's show, we're going to be discussing Dikembe Mutombo getting what's his, the Wisconsin Badgers and their disappointing loss, and a few biases I noticed as a result of the loss. Let's see. I don't really have a much bigger segment. My name is Andres Alvarez, aka Nerd Numbers, former Badgers fan. It'll be hard for me to remain one with Kaminsky and Decker out. As always, this show is produced by the wonderful Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Boxscore Brian. Give a shout out, Brian, so our listeners know your sound. And you are actually on camera, right, this time?
I am. Thanks for calling me wonderful, Dre. I always appreciate that. And as an extremely biased person myself, I'm always glad to talk about bias.
Okay, fantastic. We do not have a third geek, which makes me sad. So we will, if you don't see it next week. Patrick was willing to be on the show Monday. Then basically I called in and said, hey, there's this national game with Wisconsin involved, and I have a bunch of people in my family that are wearing red that would like me to go watch it with them. So that's what we did instead. And we figured a lot of you were probably in the same boat because despite how often we bash collegiate sports like we did last week with Jonathan Weiler, I'm willing to bet a lot of us are also still fans of it. So on that note, last week's show, our poll was if you think we should pay college athletes. I haven't looked at it in a while, Brian. How many no's are we up to? I can. What do you mean? What do you mean? When I said no, seriously, no. Yeah, I'm always, whenever we have polls about collegiate sports and paying athletes, I definitely let my bias show through. For the billionth time, we discussed this at length. If you haven't listened to the show, Jonathan Weiler, first up, I apologize for my audio. I was in a hotel room and my Wi-Fi kept cutting in and out. So I apologize for the audio there. But my big point, just the recap of the show, is I don't care about the ethics of paying players, as funny as that sounds. I care about the ethics of them being allowed to be paid. Let the colleges pay them if they want. Then we can discuss if it's right for colleges that are, in theory, places of higher learning, if they should be spending their money on athletes and spending their money basically supporting sports clubs. That's a different discussion. There is something morally reprehensible about ever saying you are not allowed to pay somebody money and at the same time allowing huge systems to profit from it. So that's my only real point. If you have an issue with that, like if you really think that college athletes shouldn't be paid, that's fine, but it shouldn't be illegal for them to be paid. That's all I'm saying there. All right, so not really related, but actually he was a person who completed his entire degree. He probably could have left the NCAA early. According to Dave's research, it would have probably helped his draft stock, but he ended up going fourth in the I forget the year, but he ended up going fourth in the NBA draft and was picked up by the Denver Nuggets, where he had five of the most glorious seasons a Denver Nugget player has ever had, wherein the Denver Nuggets upset the Seattle Supersonics the first time, a number 8 seed upset a number 1 seed. My favorite player, Dikembe Mutombo, as I mentioned in a post I wrote up that I assume Brian has in front of us, when I was a young kid, right after Dikembe Mutombo was drafted, there was like a free giveaway where Dikembe Mutombo was encouraging people to read. So it was a life-size poster of him with like 3 books on his head, and you could hang it up inside, and it was actually the 7 feet, whatever inches he is tall. It was awesome. And that was when I got into sports because, Dikembe Mutombo was like the first star. And, I rooted for the Denver Nuggets a little bit because they were mediocre with him on it. And then, of course, I got swept up in Michael Jordan fever. And, the Nuggets, after they lost to Dikembe Mutombo, were horrible. And I kind of, after Michael Jordan retired, I kind of distanced myself from basketball for a bit until the NBA, not NBA, the NCAA, I'm going to just get this wrong a million times, Brian, the NHL lockout got rid of my Colorado Avalanche. I was a hockey fan at the time, and it turned out this coincided with Melo coming to the Nuggets. more realistically, Andre Miller and Marcus Camby coming to the Nuggets, and me becoming a basketball fan again. And when I did that, I looked back at the stats, and as we've seen, Dikembe Mutombo was just head and shoulders above the rest. He's one of, I forget the list. I think we've got career totals, but he's either right at 200 wins or really close to it. He's like a top 50 all-time player. And in my opinion, just one of the most underrated players in NBA history. And he also shows a very clear bias, which is I always hear people bring up defense. A player I'm going to talk about later in the show is DeAndre Jordan. And people will say, well, his defense is so bad. Kevin Love's another player in the same boat. Their defense, their defense, their defense. I hear this over and over and over again. They've got bad defense. And because they've got bad defense, they're not elite. And then you've got Dikembe Mutombo, who's a player who was the first player to make it to Defensive Player of the Year 4 times in a row, led the league in blocks a bunch. It was just an absurdly good defensive player. There was no question about this. And then people are questioning if he belongs in the Hall of Fame. And so my kind of take on that is if there's any question that Dikembe Mutombo is first ballot, and let's not forget Dennis Rodman went second ballot. I'm hearing some people make the argument it's because they didn't realize he was eligible because I think the rule is 5 years or 7 years after your last professional game, and this includes outside of the NBA. So Dennis Rodman did after flaming out with the Lakers, did go play overseas for a bit. It's still not excusable to me. Like if you want to argue that you're someone who deserves to vote for MVPs and you don't vote Dennis Rodman and Dikembe Mutombo in first ballot, what you basically just accept is, and I'm okay with this, by the way, that defense doesn't matter. And if you want to tell me that the mainstream people that vote on awards and criteria don't think defense matters, I agree 100%. The research says that. I'm very jaded. We were having like a pre-show discussion, Brian, but I'm very jaded on the sabermetrics, the money ball, the advanced analytics movement, because what I basically see is a bunch of people trying to explain why points per game is really good. And they just have flashy new ways to show it. They have shot charts to show it. They have, fancy real-time graphs of players moving to show it. They're not really interested in the simplicity of basketball, which really is that, it's about maximizing points per possession and getting as many possessions as you can. And one of the greatest players in terms of this was Dikembe Mutombo. And basically the trick he has, we really like this type of player, is if you're going to be a low usage player, you have to be highly efficient or extremely good at defense. And in Dikembe Mutombo's case, he was both. He was really, really efficient when he had the ball. He just didn't shoot a lot. And he was remarkably good on defense and getting the ball and keeping the ball. Something that also kind of bugs me, and we'll talk this a little more later in the show, is on offense, an offensive rebound should count as offense. And most people leave it out. And one of the easiest ways to kind of observe this is if there's ever a basketball game and you take a shot and you miss and someone just gives the ball and says, try again, that's just a cheat code. And I don't think people realize the value in offense. I mean, one of the things about the Bulls that I've heard people bring up, the very last year with Michael Jordan, if you look at the Bulls, they didn't really have a lot of offense. And a huge part of that was the NBA had shortened the three-point line and then widened it again in 1998. And a lot of the Bulls were starting to age, and that the longer three-point line kind of hurt them. And Dennis Rodman was just really, really good at rebounding. And basically, Michael Jordan wasn't actually that fantastic at offense. But if you take an average offensive player and give them multiple shots with the ball, that turns them into a great offensive player. And so from that regard, Dikembe Mutombo was actually fantastically helpful on offense. As I say in the piece, he actually made it to, I think, one finals. He made it to two finals, one with Philadelphia, I believe, one with the Nets. I think he was ineffective with the Nets. Either he was on the bench or whatever. He upset the Seattle Supersonics, the best team in the league that year. Um, you know, when you just look at his accolades and accomplishments, there is no question in my mind that he's a first ballot Hall of Famer. So I'm glad he actually got the recognition he deserved here. I probably think that the voters let him in for other reasons. He's a great humanitarian outside of it. He, was also a great college player. I forget what it was called, but I think at Georgetown, was it him and Alonzo Mourning or something
It
called like
was, and
block?
I remember watching those teams back in the 80s, and that was absurd having those two guys on the court at once.
What was it called? Because it was called
Oh, I can't
something
remember the
row.
name. They did
There
not
was
win
an
the title, though, I believe. They got upset in the tournament.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm trying to think if I have anything more to say about Dikembe Mutombo, but pretty much basically fantastic that he got into the Hall of Fame. Could not be happier. I basically wrote an article, and at the end, I was very jaded. I'm happy you just said this, Brian, like you're more optimistic than me. But I'm very jaded about a lot of stuff, and so I'm happy when I'm wrong. I'm happy when I come out swinging, going, this player deserves a lot of love, but they're not going to get it, and they actually get the love they deserve. So Dikembe Mutombo, I'm going to cheat and say you're already a shout out for the week, but fantastic. You're in the Hall of Fame. Hall of Fame voters, you get a tentative clap. This is like, when they vote in the right MVP 1 or 2 years in a row, and you're like, you're on a good track. When they voted in Steve Nash, you're like, maybe they've learned. And then they vote in Derrick Rose, and you're like, oh, clearly you haven't. So it's the same ship here. I'm fully expecting a player that deserves MVP award, or not MVP, first ballot Hall of Fame consideration in some of the future drafts to be snubbed. But today, you guys get it. Congrats.
Yeah, and I've just got to add one more piece to it. You already said he's one of the best players on the court of all time, and then also off the court in terms of humanitarian things like that. I'll add a third thing to that, though, which is he's also one of the all-time personalities. And as I found out on Reddit, he said recently to a reporter he thinks that his statue, or I can't remember if it was his statue or something, should be the finger wag, that he thinks the finger wag should represent him in the Hall of Fame. So there's videos of his teammates impersonating him, and he's just, everyone loves Mutombo.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked this before with the That Thing You Like crew. They refuse to acknowledge it, but the very last season of Scrubs, which was supposed to be a spin-off show, and didn't go anywhere and had a surprisingly amount of good talent that went on to do well on other network shows, but they actually made a Dikembe Mutombo reference in there. And so, the no, 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 the finger wag, love it. I agree with Mutombo. I think the one problem for the statue, right, and I've seen this when I've tried to get pictures of Mutombo's finger wag, is it's hard to convey the movement with just a single image. And then I don't know, I think a moving statue is kind of creepy. So
Should we
it'll
go to
take
the comic book where there's like, lines showing the movement, but in bronze?
I guess, yeah, again,
That would.
it's gonna take a creative bronzer or creative statue maker to make the right Mutombo finger wag. Not like I don't know if you've seen this. There's a statue of Lucille Ball, and it is terrifying. It is the most, like, I don't know
What
who
is she
was.
doing in? Is it one of the famous scenes?
I don't even remember. Just if you look at her face, it's supposed to be Lucille Ball, and it will haunt your nightmares if you look it up. So before you get a chance to put that on air, I'm actually just going to hop to our next subject. We're actually not looking at a full hour show, obviously, this week, because I want to actually have Patrick on the show to talk, the major piece we released this week, which was an update on his bets, and we're hoping he can drag it across the finish line. All right. So, second topic, as I mentioned, I got to watch the Wisconsin Badgers blow a 9-point lead in the second half. Something to be said for just guards taking absurd shots and the shots going in. And I will be this. I will be the biased hometown fan, and refs that just don't seem to want to call fouls for your team, but are happy to call them for the other team. Those kind of two things meshed together kind of result in you losing a national game. It was a really fun experience to watch. It is interesting to be in a town that has a good college team and be at a bar when that's going on. And I don't actually want to talk too much more about that. Good game. Sad that they lost. Really disappointing, especially after that Kentucky upset. But that said, you can't feel too bad. Sports is always this weird field where there are, hundreds of good college programs out of thousands of college programs that come from many thousand more high school programs. If you make it to the national game, you are literally in like the 0.0001% of professional athletes. And, the NBA takes you even one step further. And it's so rough that the curve we grade these people on is so harsh. It's to say you are literally among the best in the world, and in Wisconsin's case, in Kentucky's case, in Duke's case, among the best to ever play college basketball, and then say you're not good enough. Because like if you look at normal grading, if I were as good in software development as that team was, as the Wisconsin team that was disappointed, as the Kentucky team that was upset are, I would be one of the best ever and be worth so much money. But in sports, we basically go, the championship litmus test. I hate it so much when you go, Steve Nash is great, but he was
What do you
never on
say?
a championship team. Dikembe Mutombo was great. He was never on a championship team. That Kentucky team was good, but they didn't win a championship. I hate that test. Fantastic team. On that note, there are two biases that I want to talk about. So, no surprise, the Wisconsin team is comprised of a lot of white players, which definitely is always a weird subject, especially in professional basketball, which, is predominantly African American. And one kind of thing, I'm actually going to get political on this one, Brian, another person being shot by the police. And I hate the just general consensus in this country that we don't have a race problem. And there are two major areas. One's going to be innocuous, one's going to be is like serious. But the innocuous one is professional sports. I swear to God, every time I hear that unathletic player to describe a player whose only characteristic that could potentially qualify them that is that they are white, I just want to scream. I saw an article with Frank Kaminsky being listed as, an athlete that doesn't look like an athlete. And here's the thing about Frank Kaminsky. Frank Kaminsky is 7 feet tall, some give or take, right? I don't know exact measurements. He hasn't gone to the combine yet. He's got a wingspan that's huge. I know he's got huge hands. If you watch, I got to see a lot of commercials with him while I was watching the game, and they have him holding out like two balls like that or whatever. And if you look at his arms, he actually has a very well-defined arms. They're big arms. They're not skinny. There is nothing unathletic about Frank Kaminsky. If you stood next to Frank Kaminsky and told him he looked unathletic, you would look like the most absurd person. Now, of course, you watch on TV and all you can see is he's white and he's next to a bunch of other tall people. Fine. But there is nothing unathletic about Frank Kaminsky. And I was actually at the game with my cousin-in-law, and he's, I think, 6'2" to 6'4", somewhere in that realm. Standing next to him, I'm like, holy cow, you're tall. And I was talking to him and I said, the funny thing is, if you were in the NBA, you would just be a guard. You would be one of the shortest positions on the court. And I had a friend in high school who was 6'6", and everybody told him, you look like you should play basketball. The idea that anybody who is above 6 feet 6 inches, and this includes Kevin Love, Frank Kaminsky, and Mark Gasol, and I'll bring up why those matter in a second, calling them unathletic is just absurd. Saying you look athletic when you're super tall is absurd because I believe the stat, Brian, is if you are 7 feet tall or taller and between I think the ages of like 20 and 35 and are in the United States, there is a 1 in 11 chance that you are in the NBA right now. That's how the stats boil out. There is nothing more indicative of you being athletic, which I'm going to define athletic in this case as meaning likely to play athletics professionally, than being tall. So to ever call any tall player unathletic just because they're white, I hate that bias. I hate that absurdity. And part of like what we get into, and so like I said, another sad story, unarmed black person being gunned down by the cops, is there is this mythos that being African American, I believe Vox, I think it's Vox or 538. I apologize, Brian, I didn't prepare you for this, so I don't know which, but like Vox wrote about how there's this mythos that like African American people are just somehow more or like superhuman, which makes no sense, right? Like the reason cops unload on them so much is that they have this fear that they're like, well, they're going to be able to run through a bullet, even though that's an absurd belief. And this not to be mean, this is definitely pervasive, especially in professional sports. In professional sports, we notice this belief that it's just like the article I wrote a few years back was Kevin Love and the Myth of Natural Ability. So they had all the GMs vote on a bunch of random things, who's the most clutch player, who deserves MVP, who's going to win the title. And one of the weird things, and I think after like 2 or 3 years of the obvious bias from the GMs, they got rid of the award. But it was the player that does the most with the least natural athletic ability or something like that. And Kevin Love had won it 2 years in a row by a landslide. And again, Kevin Love is the son of, I believe, a professional basketball player, a professional athlete of some sort. He's 6 feet 8. He is, got giant hands, a giant wingspan. There is nothing unathletic about Kevin Love. Another player that was also marked was Mark Gasol, who again is a 7-footer. And a player that Patrick brought up when he read the article the first time was, what about Isaiah Thomas, who is, under 6 feet tall, slower down the court than Kevin Love, according to combine data, can't really jump. Like you have a short, tiny guy in the NBA who's clearly not athletic. You have a giant who is the son of a professional athlete. How on earth could you say least natural ability to the person who is the son of a professional athlete who is over 6 feet 8 tall? Absurd. And that's kind of this pervasive thing where sports show this odd belief that is damaging. That is that basically being African American means you're superhuman, which is absurd and not true. And cops that seem to believe they need to use excessive force as a result, that's an even worse pervasive part of this myth that, is very much in the United States culture. So sorry, Brian, to get on my like political high horse, but the if you're white, you're not athletic myth just drives me nuts. And then the dark side of that exact same racism, and I'm going to call it out. I'm really also getting sick while I'm on my high horse about things that drive me nuts. The like when you call someone out on being racist and they go, "I'm not a racist. I just was ignorant in this thing." You were racist. Get over it. You were racist for a moment. It doesn't mean your life is over. The correct response is, "I'm not a racist." The correct response is, "I'm sorry. What did I do wrong? How can I do better in the future?" So again, anybody that comes out and is like, I don't think the people that call white athletes unathletic are racist. I don't think the people that say, I don't think the cops that, shot 10 times plus onto an unarmed black person are racist. No, get over it. They were racist in that moment. We have to do better. I'm really, really sick of those two biases. Whoa, sorry. Anything to go on from there, Brian? When I don't have guests on, it occurs to me I just like to rant on a soapbox.
No, not really. At least all those white guys have going for them that they have high basketball IQ, because it seems to me like 100% of white players have high basketball IQ, according to these same media folks that say they're unathletic. So, yeah, that's funny to me also.
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite myths in this vein is Larry Bird, who people call Larry Bird unathletic. And even Mike Birbiglia, when he's talked about him, he said, Larry Bird gives all the white guys from Boston hope that they could play ball. And he's like, but like Larry Bird had like hands like bear claws, right? He had giant hands. He was super tall. Anybody that said he couldn't run or couldn't jump, just like, I get to invoke the eye test, and I didn't even get to watch that much Larry Bird because, back in the day, the hilarious thing is the computer monitor I'm looking at in front of me right now, which is a Surface Pro, all of you Windows haters can hate it, is probably bigger than the television screen I had when I was watching basketball, when I was watching Dikembe Mutombo and Michael Jordan play when I was a kid, because I had like a tiny 13, 15-inch screen in my room. And you just had to pick up whatever the antenna got. So, the simple fact of the matter is anybody that says they don't think Larry Bird could run, jump, or was unathletic is just fooling themselves. They're not watching. And I mean, clearly no one likes being called out. And like I said, you get the conversation gets dragged down very quickly. But when you basically say your problem is on a television screen, you see a white person and you go, unathletic. Sorry, I'm calling a spade there. Um, and yeah, full warning, because this has been one of those. You guys have been fantastic in the comments. When Jonathan Weiler was on, he actually said he was really impressed with how intelligent our comments are. And even now, like the complaint I have about our current comment this week is we are literally arguing over about the proper way to record numbers for bets in Vegas, which to me, like, I think it's a little funny. I'm not offended, but it's like, that's how great you guys are, or people are, as commenters of the Boxscore Geeks, is that you are intelligent commenters that argue about minutia. But I've noticed a few times when we bring up race, and I think we actually have, this is kind of cool, some overseas people. It's easy to get into the territory of essentially white privilege, which is you don't notice the problem. So when other people like myself start screaming about it, you're like, what? Calm down. It is a problem. Just be careful with the comments there, because I have a very short fuse on this. In the United States, we literally can't go a month without fighting out about police brutality towards minorities. Uh, and so as a result, I'm not really in the mood to hear how it's not that big of a deal. So that's what I got there. All right. So Brian didn't have anything more to add, or is,
Not on this one.
I threw a bunch of stuff at you, so I know you're always furiously typing to get more links up. What I will actually go into now is another bias, and after that one, this one is going to seem so trivially stupid, but I love rebounding, and I think people massively overrate it in the NBA, and it really bugs me. And at least against Kentucky, Wisconsin showed the power of out rebounding the other team. Because when you get a rebound, as I was saying with Dikembe Mutombo, You get a second shot. It does any a mediocre shooter with two shots is a better player than a good player with one shot virtually all the time. And Wisconsin, the big reason I don't think they're going to be great next year is they have this guy named Frank Kaminsky, who is a 7-footer who pulled down, I think, 23 rebounds between the semifinals and finals game. It's absurd. And one of the things and the same thing was true in the first half of the championship game. Wisconsin could not make a basket to save their life, but they kept getting second chance points, and that's why they stayed in the game. And it's one of these things in basketball where a player that I brought up that I still get hate on Twitter to this day, and I'm not going to stop saying it. DeAndre Jordan deserves MVP consideration this season. And, basically the Clippers, their problem, they have the Oklahoma City Thunder issue, which is they've got a few really, really good players and just the front office has progressively put the depth around them as horrible, horrible players. That team has Austin Rivers and Glenn Davis on it and is still going to make the playoffs. That should tell you the caliber of player DeAndre Jordan and Chris Paul are. And, it's just one of these things where when you explain how good rebounding is, the argument you'll get, I'll hear the steal rebounding argument, which first off, as we've mentioned many, many times, the wins produced formula actually has a diminishing returns coefficient for defensive rebounds based on your rate of rebounding and your teammates' rate of rebounding. So for DeAndre Jordan, who we still consider the best player according to points over par, that is factored into that equation. I don't take too much offense that most people don't actually dig into the math to understand how equations such as per, win shares, wins produced, or points over par work, but it's there. But additionally, it annoys me that the exact same logic for stealing rebounds doesn't apply to stealing shots. And the regression seems to indicate every time you take a shot, you are stealing that shot from your teammates. Now, stealing is just a semantic word that we're going to use here because you could say making the decision to allocate the shot to you instead of your teammates. For instance, LeBron James is virtually always the best player to take a shot unless he's hotly, covered, and then passing the ball is the right move. So it's not a steal of a shot when LeBron James takes a shot most of the time because he's the best option on the team. The same way that it's like DeAndre Jordan is not stealing shots from his teammates because he shoots like above 60% true shooting. Stealing rebounds gets into an interesting territory because the data doesn't really support what people are suggesting, which is every time you get a rebound, you take a full rebound from your team. On defensive rebounds, what it seems to indicate is every time you get a defensive rebound, you lower, all other things being equal, the defensive rebounds that your teammates would get by about 0.5, seeming to indicate that something we already know, defensive rebounds are, some of the time are just going to be grabbed up by the defending team. But that said, that doesn't mean they're not valuable. And in DeAndre Jordan's case, he is fantastic at offensive rebounds, which is one of those things that you don't steal from your teammates. You don't steal offensive rebounds from your teammates because it's really hard to get offensive rebounds because the defense tends to have more people boxing out. So rebounds are really valuable. And I was really, really hoping that Wisconsin was going to keep up out rebounding the opponent and win that game, which didn't end up happening because it just shows the value of rebounding. And Kaminsky, again, this player that first bias, right? Unathletic white guy, but also just this bias against rebounds. And I've never seen the vitriol for DeAndre Jordan when I've said positive things about him. I've talked about this before on the show, as I have for other subjects. And it's really weird to me because people just don't seem to get the value of getting the ball in basketball. In baseball, it seems pretty intuitive, right? If you get a foul tip instead of striking out, that's valuable because you get to keep batting. If I strike the guy out, it's valuable because they don't get to keep batting. In basketball, it's the same way. If we don't get the rebound, the other team gets another shot. If we get the rebound on offense, we get another shot. That's how you win the game. I was watching a baseball game and the sideline reporters said, and I think this was unironically, they said, as we mentioned in tonight's keys of the game, the key things are to throw strikes and to hit strikes. And I just stared on and off, and I didn't know how to respond to that because they were literally, this is describing baseball. And in basketball, it's so weird to me that you still have to explain various facets of the game that, like, getting the ball is a good thing. And people still, this is why I'm very pessimistic on the advanced stats movement, Brian. People still don't seem to get that simplicity. Getting the ball is a good thing. And back in the day, when players, I think the biggest change, there were two big changes in NBA history. The first was they changed from players voting for the MVP. And when players voted for the MVP is when we noticed players like Bill Russell, Bill Walton, Moses Malone getting the MVP, and they were fantastic rebounders. When you had your contemporaries who knew how you boxed them out and got the ball, voting on you. That's when you got these players getting MVP. And when we changed it to the mainstream media, that's when you got the people, the same people who watch a game and notice a white guy and say, Larry Bird's unathletic, which is absurd. When you got those people voting, that's when they just started noticing the scores. And the easy reason why, if you look at old box scores, which you can see at Basketball Reference, it used to just record points basically. And so it makes sense when you give the responsibility of voting on MVP to people who just have a single box score. That's what they're going to use, and that invaded kind of the thinking. And then when you got Michael Jordan, who was really good at scoring, and we got this idea that a guard that could score was key to winning a title, those two things together completely kind of changed the modern thinking, or at least that's my hypothesis, of basketball. And it's still around. And the problem you have is all of the old hats, Paul Shirley on the show we had said, you're not going to see these front offices change until they stop hiring players that have old school mentality. It's the same thing here. Until you get the editors out of the publications like ESPN that still think points per game are big, we're not going to see a change in that thinking. And as long as those people are parroting it, the people that read it and respond to us on Twitter are going to think we're crazy when we say DeAndre Jordan deserves consideration for MVP. One last note, I figured I'd just wrap up and explain kind of my thinking on the MVP. When we look at the MVP award, it is very clear that it doesn't always go to the best player in the league. In fact, it seems very clear that a huge part of the MVP is narrative. Steve Nash, Derrick Rose, Allen Iverson, those MVPs all occurred because the narrative of the team overwhelmed the media and they liked it. So my kind of view, even though this isn't written in stone anywhere for the MVP, is you have an elite threshold. Basically, a player has to be playing at an elite level to be considered an MVP player. After that, use whatever barometer you want. Use a metric, use a narrative, use which player you like. You're a hometown fan. They just have to cross that elite threshold. That's why, I'll never respect someone who votes for Carmelo Anthony for MVP. But this season, as I've said, if I had a vote, I would vote for Russell Westbrook. And part of that is love the triple doubles. Can't hate on the triple doubles. The reason Russell Westbrook is good isn't scoring. The reason he's good is because of rebounds and assists. Additionally, I would love to see a player on a team that either doesn't make the playoffs or is a bottom seed with a player that played fewer than 70 games win an MVP. So I'm okay with narrative being your driving force for MVP voting as long as you make sure the player is at least X good. And so there are lots of players that I would kick out. Derrick Rose, when he won, was one of them. Kobe Bryant, I think, actually is very close. He's borderline. So I think he got in a few times, but I think he's close. Melo definitely is one of them. There are lots of players that I would kick out, say you're not allowed to vote for him. Westbrook before this year would have been one of them. After that, use whatever standard you want because the MVP award clearly does not have a set of standards. They don't just say vote for the best player in the league or vote for the best player on a team. The metric people seem to use, which we can look through old school voting, is the top scorer on a winning team that people think can win a title. If that's the case, then this year is going to come down to James Harden versus Steph Curry. And I'm totally on the side of Steph Curry taking the award. So that's where I stand there. I think I've got all my rants out, Brian. Anything else to go off of?
Yeah, those are some good rants. Not much to add to that.
Oh yeah, you and I, as I mentioned last week, we went and saw WrestleMania. We're gonna have to talk about that at some point. I just don't see a tie in here, and I don't feel like talking about it today. So just keep that in mind. We'll keep that in the back burner for a future. So maybe an off-season show because we are already hitting that time of basketball where lots of players. I tweeted this out earlier today. We have lots of DMPs. Who cares? You're not even watching anyway. We're not making the playoffs. So, I'm starting to get excited about baseball, although the Brewers have been getting beat up by my former team, the Rockies. So we'll have to see how baseball season goes. Excited to see how the playoffs go for basketball. I really think the West has gotten scary. We didn't even mention this. I think in the original notes, I want to talk more with Patrick about this, but I'm going to mess up his name. Kawhi and Dwight are back. And Dwight's been playing limited minutes, but has been playing like a star in those minutes. And Kawhi has just been on fire.
And those two teams are squaring off twice this week with the second seed on the line, I believe.
And one of Patrick's bets, which we might talk next week on the line. So it's like
Oh.
the West
The
is just
Spurs
gonna.
over? Is that the bet you're talking about?
It's the Spurs winning the conference. So
Oh,
them
okay.
beating Houston is huge. If they
Okay.
can take Houston twice, that might be enough for them to take it.
We need some money.
Yeah.
I'm
So
part of that
it's
portfolio as well, just for, ethical purposes here. I'll state that.
all right. I'm not stating anything. But the West is just going to be. There's a championship team that's going to go home in round two. That's just how the West is going to play out this year. And the East, we're going to have we there is a potential for there to be 1 to 2 losing teams in the first round. So this is absurd. I don't know the way to fix this, but I definitely don't like having good teams not in the playoffs. I definitely don't like the idea that Anthony Davis or Russell Westbrook is going to be sitting at home because there's only one seed for those two teams, and one of them's going to lose it. So when it all comes down to it, makes me sad. And the West is going to be a lot of fun to watch. And I think I'm not going to care about the East until it's Atlanta versus Cleveland. That's kind of where I sit now.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about this. I don't know if we want to make it so no one in the East gets into the playoffs. That would be kind of weird for media markets and all that. It's like, for instance, back when Barry Bonds was really in his heyday, hitting the juice, hitting a ton of home runs, there was a movement in baseball to say, well, we should get rid of the intentional walk. It shouldn't be part of the game because it's not letting Barry play. And of course, no one's talking about that anymore. It was just kind of a one-time thing for a short period.
If you
Some
look at the East, though, if it wasn't for the Bulls, if it wasn't for
It's
the Bulls in the
dreadful.
'90s, after the bad boy Pistons and Celtics disappeared, that conference would be just dreadful. So
We all know the fix for this, though, Dre, right? It's not realignment, it's relegation. Give those guys something to play for.
yeah, I would be okay with that. I mean, I still no one likes this idea, but I still think that they should do a Baltimore, is it Browns? But they should do a Baltimore situation where in the middle of the night the Knicks
Yeah.
wake up and they're suddenly in San Antonio, and the San Antonio Spurs wake up and they're playing in Madison Square Gardens. That's my personal opinion.
Oh, that would be funny. That
Yeah,
goes against everything about sports, though. The little guy beating the big guy, even though the league secretly hates it, or not so secretly.
I don't care. It's so funny to me that we are so staunchly in favor of defending states just as this ethereal thing and not in favor of supporting fans. Like, it doesn't matter that Utah Jazz fans are committed. That is a horrible market for a team. And I think it's bad business. And if we really want to say the NBA cares about its fans, then you have another team in Los Angeles and another two teams in New York. So
Like we always say, Inland Empire, right? They're the ones that really need a team.
Inland Empire.
Yeah, absolutely. Look up the Inland Empire. They're the biggest media market without a pro sports team.
Is that like Maine and all that jazz or whatever? Or?
No, it's in Southern California.
So, oh, okay. I didn't even know. I'm showing my ignorance.
Irvine
So,
type area. Yeah, I might be butchering this. I'm a Northern California guy, but that's what I believe. Yeah.
all right. You're probably right. Yeah. New York and Los Angeles could use another team. I think that's all I got. I'm trying to think. Shout outs. I got Dikembe Mutombo this week. Oh, and this one, I did not give this to you. But the other shout out I have on the topic of wrestling, even though we didn't talk it at all, is a guy named Max Landis. He's pretty well known. He's a screenwriter in Hollywood, son of a famous Landis. So, I don't think he needs our shout out, but he still deserves it. He made a movie called Wrestling is Not Wrestling, which basically goes over the character of Hunter Hearst Helmsley. So it's really weird because, in professional wrestling, a lot of people go by the name that they use in the stage outside of that. So when I say Triple H or Hunter Hearst Helmsley, people think both the real person and the not real person, but he basically talked the narrative of the in character, the in WWE universe character. It is fantastic. Wrestling is not wrestling. One of those things that if you're a wrestling fan or even not a wrestling fan, check it out. And then a hat tip to that thing you like. It was their WrestleMania wrap-up show that they had that I heard about it. And I paused their show and went and watched it. And it was definitely worth 20, 30 minutes.
Now, I'm
So
showing Wrestling Isn't Wrestling right now, and it has over 1 million hits on YouTube, and yeah, I recommend it as well.
Yeah,
Sorry,
so
Dre,
if
keep
you're
going.
if you haven't seen it yet, I mean, actually, Brian, I would be okay. We could just steal that
Oh,
sweet,
it looks
sweet
like
YouTube
Macaulay
juice.
Culkin and Seth Green are in it. Is that
They
true?
are. They actually
Oh,
do
that's
show up and
funny.
they're explaining DX. But if you just the last 20 minutes, just put that on here. We get that sweet, sweet YouTube juice. Make this video get, 50,000 followers or something. You could do that instead. I'll also defer to you. Do you have any shout outs to give this week? I realize I didn't ask you pre-show.
I'll give a wrestling shout out too. In addition to going to WrestleMania with you, Dre, which was a great time. Thanks again for that. We'll talk about at some point. I also attended our local promotion here in Oakland, California for the first time called Hood Slam. It was amazing. In some ways, better than WrestleMania. So yeah, we'll have to talk about that someday too.
Oh, tough words. Better than WrestleMania. Although
Well, it's completely different. Completely different experience.
as you know, we were at WrestleMania together. I have some thoughts. So
Oh, good.
we'll save
Good
those. We'll
tease.
save
Good
those for
tease.
later. All right. So with that said, a reminder, I am Nerd Numbers. You can find me on Twitter with that username. If for whatever reason you heard this show without finding it through the site, you can find us at boxscoregeeks.com. Make sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher. You can find it as The Boxscore Geeks Show. Subscribe, vote it up. Definitely helps to get the listens. You can also find the show on Channel Nerd Numbers on YouTube, and then I have a playlist for the Boxscore Geeks Show. Every week we update it, so you can, if you want to see the live show, all the great work that Brian puts into this, you can check that out. I think that's all I got. And then a reminder, we are produced by our fabulous, I went with fabulous and wonderful this week, Brian. I must be in a good mood. Box Score Brian on Twitter, Brian Foster. That's all I got. And with that, we'll see you next week.